I have the distinct privilege to be able to introduce Laura DeNardis, who has been both a friend and a mentor to me over the years, as well as being a senior scholar of internet governance and architecture with a long and distinguished career, even though she's very young. So let me just say a little bit about Laura. She's currently an associate professor in the School of Communication at American. She's also an affiliated fellow of the Yale Information Society Project, which is where we met. Laura was the executive director there for a number of years.
3 years.
3 years. For those of you who don't know it, the Information Society Project is a wonderful interdisciplinary space at Yale Law School, which Laura really sort of built into an active program of folks coming from all over the disciplines to basically spend a couple years in residence and write pieces about internet-related issues, whether it goes back to when I was there sort of studying campaigning to things like free speech, anonymity, et cetera. And Laura really built that program into, I think, what it is today. She is the author of a couple books, which I just learned she's going to be talking today for a forthcoming book with Yale University Press called The Global War for Internet Governance. In addition to that, she is the editor of the volume Opening Standards, The Global Politics of Interoperability, which was with MIT Press last year, and Protocol Politics, which is, I think, probably the best book on internet governance and regulation within, I think, one of the leading lights in the field. And that was published with MIT Press as well in 2009. Laura did her PhD in Science and Technology Studies at Virginia Tech and has an AB in Engineering Science from Dartmouth and a Master's in Engineering from Cornell University. So she actually knows what she's talking about when she does internet studies because she's done on both sides, both the academic study of it and the actual engineering of it. So without further ado, I will shut up and hand this over to my friend Laura DeNardis.
Thank you so much, Daniel, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm absolutely delighted to be here. I've been wanting to come down for quite a while, and it's nice to be out of DC today and to actually see cherry blossoms on campus. I can't believe it. It's so lovely here. And I want to thank Daniel for inviting me, and Shri and others. It is very nice to be here. The title of my presentation is The Worldwide War for Internet Governance. It's a book that I recently wrote. It's going to be published this fall by Yale University Press. Now, I selected a very provocative title intentionally. The title is actually going to be The Global War for Internet Governance. I used worldwide war today because I'm going to be talking about some World Wide Web internet governance issues, so it's just a play on words. But I did select the provocative title because I think that internet governance controversies are the new spaces where a lot of economic and political power is unfolding in the 21st century. There are a lot of struggles there. If you think about technologies of internet governance, they intersect with a lot of civil liberties issues like freedom of expression and privacy. They're certainly entangled with national security. They're entangled with innovation policy. But the distributed nature of these technologies is shifting these kinds of policy areas away from traditional nation-state governance to things like the design of technical architecture and the policies of private companies. So this is very interesting to me. Now, many of the functions are also institutionally and technically very complex and to a certain extent outside of public view. But how the current conflicts will settle, I'll discuss some of them today, will determine some very important public policy issues in the decade to come. What do you think about when you think of the term internet governance? It conjures up a host of seemingly unrelated topics, such as the recent Syrian internet outage in the middle of political turmoil. It invokes media narratives about the United Nations trying to take over internet governance. We see that a lot in the media. It invokes things like Google's decision not to acquiesce to the United States' request to take down the incendiary Innocence of Muslims video. Or you could also think about the constantly changing mercurial privacy policies of social network. These are all forms of governance. And they're somewhat in the public sphere, these issues, but they exist only at the surface of internet governance. There are a lot of technologically concealed and institutionally complex there's really an ecosystem of these complex institutional and technical governance areas. I'll discuss them today. How do you study this? I can only speak to how I study it because there are a lot of ways to do it. I study it really from three perspectives. I have a background in information engineering and a lot of experience. Daniel was kind to call me young, but I have about 25 years of experience doing information engineering. I also have doctoral studies in science and technology studies, and I spent about 5 years at Yale Law School studying the intersections of law, technology, and society. So for me, it's interdisciplinary from the start. And it's, as I said, it does extend, and certainly the way I study it, extends beyond institutions. So you can study it from the standpoint of what are institutions doing, and that certainly is part of it, including traditional nation-state bureaucracy. Or you can study it also to account for the rising privatization of power, the rising privatization of governance, and the embedded politics of technical architecture. So that's really what I focus on, the embedded politics of technical architecture. Now, not all of these internet governance conflicts are outside of public view, of course. You probably know that thousands of websites went dark, or at least altered their opening screens to protest anti-piracy legislation that was moving through the United States Congress. Remember how Wikipedia blacked out its English language site for 24 hours, instead displaying this banner reading, "Imagine a world without free knowledge." Reddit and thousands of other popular sites blocked access to their content, and I need my Reddit, so we couldn't get the content. Google blacked out its famous Google Doodle on the opening search screen, and advocacy groups gathered millions of signatures, and Congress received millions of phone calls. The protest and mass internet boycotts were over two bills moving through the United States Congress, SOPA and PIPA. One was the Stop Online Piracy Act, and the other was the Protect IP Act, as I'm sure you well know. These bills were trying to address the illegal online trafficking of copyrighted media and trademarked goods. The anti-piracy motivation of this, it initially had very broad bipartisan support. It would have increased penalties for intellectual property rights violations. It would have increased the ability of law enforcement and media content companies to go to search engines and go to ISPs and request help in taking down content. And it would have enabled these same entities to go to intermediaries such as advertising firms and financial intermediaries such as Visa, MasterCard, PayPal, etc., to direct them to cease payments to some of these sites that were engaging in piracy. But the object of the boycott was not really the anti-piracy intent of the bill, but it was rather how some of the mechanisms in the bill would have altered some aspects of the internet's cultural, technical, and institutional history. I want to explain that from the standpoint of internet governance, and to do that, I want to give one example. One concern involved a technology called the domain name system, which I'm sure everyone has heard of. The DNS, or domain name system, it performs a simple function of translating between the alphanumeric names that we type into a computer, like twitter.com, and then it translates that into the binary addresses that a computer will use to route information to the destination. So it's kind of like a phone book in a way. It serves a function similar to the postal system. Now, the universally consistent resolution of words into numbers is a basic mechanism keeping the internet operational, and therefore it's a basic mechanism of internet governance. This process is overseen by entities called registries, internet registries, also called registry operators, with one registry running the .com domain, top-level domain, one running .edu, one running .biz. See, there are a lot of different registries that do this. For example, you might have heard of VeriSign. VeriSign is the registry for the .com top-level domain, for example. Now, you have to kind of follow the logic of what's happening here and why there was a protest about this specific area. So try to focus in on the issue, because some of the language is a little bit complicated. Each registry operator globally disseminates a file. It's an authoritative file that instructs what are called non-authoritative network operators, such as internet service providers, to direct them how to translate names into numbers. So what this does is it creates a universal and standardized mechanism for consistently resolving domain names into addresses, regardless of physical geography or jurisdiction. The proposed legislation would have changed this a little bit. It would have required the non-authoritative operators to block websites by altering the authoritative information that it receives from those centralized registry operators. So just keep that in mind for a minute. Another way to say it is that an internet service provider, for example, would be obliged to resolve a domain name into a different binary address other than the one that the global internet universally dictates from the authoritative registry, presumably redirecting it to a law enforcement message such as the following. This is an actual message. You probably know, or if you don't, you'll find out right now, that national governments already have the ability to order registries that are under their jurisdiction to block access to domain names. This is a common practice carried out in the United States. It's carried out by the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency, an agency of the Homeland Security Department. But governments do not have this direct jurisdiction when a name is resolved in a top-level domain controlled by a foreign registry. So in entities such as ICE, the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency, they can go to, for example, VeriSign, and they do, and they say, Louis Vuitton knockoffs.com, we need to block. I'm just making up a fake website. So the registry will go in there, they'll modify the authoritative mapping, they'll send it to a website with this kind of a message, and then they also disseminate that to all the non-authoritative registries. So hence, because of this jurisdictional problem, governments have an interest in ordering network operators within their own borders to modify the standard domain name resolution process. Are you following that? So what's the problem with that? This modification from a universally consistent system to a balkanized approach in which sometimes one area would resolve it into one website, another area would resolve it into another website. This really complicates the security and the administration of the domain name system, as well as transforming the internet from a universal infrastructure to one that varies from country to country. During legislative deliberations, just bear with me here, I want to give you some examples of how it became clear. I'm going to skip over the examples, and I'll get to that in a minute. But it did become clear that policymakers were really not familiar with the basic functioning of the DNS. And what happened is that a lot of experts, including 83 prominent internet engineers and one of the developers of TCP/IP, a core protocol of the internet, set of protocols, sent a letter to Congress. They were warning them that the potentially catastrophic bill would risk fragmenting the domain name system, engender censorship, create fear and uncertainty for technological innovation, seriously harm the credibility of the United States in its role as a steward of key internet infrastructure. Separately from this letter, some respected security experts, including Steve Crocker, who's a big name in internet engineering, claimed that the website redirection provisions were inconsistent with a very important security protocol called Domain Name System Security Extensions. And they explained, it's a very technical issue, but they explained that concern. In my opinion, these concerns seemed to be ignored by the politicians who were debating the bill. In fact, one of the main sponsors of SOPA was quoted in The Hill as saying that the criticisms of the bill were completely hypothetical and suggested that none of it was based in reality. The concerns that were expressed by internet engineering experts were really in themselves insufficient to stop the progression of the bills, which still during this time retained bipartisan support. It had vocal backing of mainstream media corporations and, of course, the powerful lobbies from organizations that are very detrimentally impacted by piracy. So pharmaceutical industries, of course, motion picture and music industries. So there were a lot of interests, as always, on each side of this. But opposition to the bill gathered momentum, and it really took off when the framing was changed. So the framing was successfully changed to one of an anti-piracy framing, to a don't break the internet framing and also an internet freedom framing, concerned about censorship and prior restraints on expression. So when the internet freedom framing in particular started disseminating in the media and through advocacy groups, that's when a lot of citizens were really able to understand that something was happening, even if they didn't understand entirely what the technical issues were. Now, this confrontation, as I'm sure you can tell just from the little bit I've said here, it was grounded in a real technological and social concern, but it was also culturally constructed. It was discursively escalated by all kinds of interests with a stake in the outcome. After the unprecedented protests and blackouts, the bills were ultimately tabled, at least for now. Now, this conflict was very atypical of internet governance conflicts in that it played out on a public stage. And the reason that I wanted to lead with this example is because you probably have heard about it. Some of you may have been involved in signing petitions and other activism. But it was also typical, it was typical in involving multiple stakeholders. It played out locally, but it would have had sweeping global effects, just like other internet governance issues. Topically, it touched upon many issues of internet governance that I discuss in my upcoming book. It talked about internet infrastructure security and stability and the politics of that. It dealt with the policy role of internet companies, the efficacy of internet protocols. It touched upon the globally coordinated control system of the domain name system. And of course, the relationship between intellectual property and internet architecture. These are the issues at the heart of global internet governance. So I want to say a little bit about the tasks of internet governance. There are any number of ways to create a taxonomy for understanding this, of course. If I were to give a definition of internet governance, I would probably say the following sentence. The primary task of internet governance involves the design and administration of the technologies necessary to keep the internet operational and the enactment of substantive policy issues around this architecture. But really, it involves layer upon layer upon layer of functions. I'd like to go just through a few examples of how internet governance works in practice around these various functions, and then politically, what is at stake in some of these activities. Now, one historically contentious area of internet governance involves what's called critical internet resources. These include things like internet addresses, autonomous system numbers, and domain names. Think about how devices are able to exchange information only if they possess a unique binary number known as an IP address or Internet Protocol address. It's either assigned permanently or temporarily for a session. You know what domain names are. They're just the alphanumeric names such as www.danielcrease.com, .org rather, that make websites easily locatable to humans. You probably haven't heard, though, of autonomous system numbers, which are just as important because these are the unique binary number assigned to a network operator, usually called an autonomous system in engineering. Who gets to have an autonomous system number and become a network operator? That's kind of an interesting area. And there's no time to go into that now, but it just, all of these ask questions about who has the authority to design these unique numbers, who has the authority to distribute them, and who may possess them, and what public accountability is there over this. Let me give you a few specific examples. Now, the requirement that each identifier be globally unique for all of these, it has necessitated a certain form of governance and centralized coordination. And the global struggle over who controls and administers this is really a long-standing concern of internet governance. Power struggles have reflected tensions between the United States and the United Nations, and especially struggles over ultimate control of something called the root zone file, containing I would describe it as the authoritative mapping of top-level domains into internet addresses. It's a very small file, but someone has to authoritatively control what that is and make modifications to it. There's been a historic relationship of the United States Commerce Department to that file, and that relationship continues to this day. There are also numerous relatively new institutions as well as private companies involved in governance of these resources. So you probably heard of ICANN, the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers. That's a private nonprofit corporation with responsibility over many functions of critical Internet resources and Internet administration generally. So they, under ICANN, there's also something called IANA, the Internet Assigned Numbers Authority, which allocates numbers to 5 regional Internet registries, which in turn allocate the numbers to Internet service providers and assign them to end users. So it's quite a hierarchy. There's also the registry system that's made up of private and private nonprofit entities that control the DNS servers and the DNS resolution process, so that's a whole other area. There are hundreds of registrars. How many people watched the Daytona 500 because Danica Patrick was in it? Okay, the ratings went up by 13%. There was controversy over the video, the copyright over the video at the Daytona 500. If you're not following me, the reason I know this is because I follow internet registrars like GoDaddy, and Danica Patrick is the spokesperson for GoDaddy. There are enormous public policy issues around all of these areas. Let me mention just a few. Who owns United.com? United Airlines, United Arab Emirates? Is it the Manchester United soccer fans? The list goes on and on. There's the issue of adjudicating domain name trademark disputes. There's a global system of governance that transcends national boundaries. It's designed to make the process of resolving these trademark disputes very expeditious. It's called the Uniform Domain Name Dispute Resolution Process. You could write an entire doctoral dissertation just on that, if anyone's interested. It's a really big issue. Another issue is the question of when to authorize new top-level domains, like is .xxx okay? And who decides what counts as free expression in these top-level domains in the public sphere? Another policy problem involves the privacy implications and complexities of the engineering decision to have globally unique identifiers. So I'll come back to some privacy issues later about that. And still a larger political problem is the global impasse over the historic role of the United States and pressure internationally to continue to distribute authority over some of the centralized functions. So this is an extremely, when you start talking about autonomous system numbers, it starts out sounding boring, but when you look at all the policy issues around it, it's a very delicate and political area of international controversy. Okay, setting internet standards, this is my favorite area. This is another technical and political area. What's an internet standard? An internet standard or protocol enables devices that are made by different manufacturers to exchange information if they follow the rules that are laid out by these protocols. Some of you are updating your Facebook status right now. You're probably using Wi-Fi, you may be using Bluetooth, you're using HTTP, someone's listening to a song, you're listening to MP3. If you just made a call recently, you probably over the internet, you probably used voice over the internet protocol. These are all internet standards. The development of these standards, as well as the implementation, is a very powerful seat of authority over internet policy. They serve a critical and straightforward technical function, but they have direct economic and political implications. They're set by global standard-setting organizations. Can anyone shout out a few examples? You probably have heard of the Internet Engineering Task Force. You probably have heard of the World Wide Web Consortium, maybe the IEEE. It's an acronym soup of different standards that are out there. They're almost never seen by the public. Like we know basically what Wi-Fi is because we use that directly. But a single device can embed hundreds of these standards. They have sweeping political and economic effects. Think about how encryption standards directly intersect with privacy, and they often mediate between competing values like individual civil liberties versus national security. Think about a protocol like BitTorrent. This performs a very straightforward technical function related to file distribution, but it's almost universally associated with piracy. Think about the Do Not Track protocol that is seeking to provide some privacy for those wishing to opt out of online advertising behavioral tracking. Other standards determined accessibility to the web for the disabled. So it's a very important public policy area. Now, whereas protocol design does have these political implications, then the procedures by which they are established are a fundamental governance concern. It's related to expertise, to public accountability, and legitimacy. What is the legitimacy of private organizations to establish public policy is the basic question. Cybersecurity governance, I'll just say a little bit about that challenging area. Beginning with the 1988 Morris worm, I was at Cornell when Robert Morris unleashed this worm, so I always use that as my starting point because it's when I found out about internet security issues, to the more recent Stuxnet code targeting Iranian nuclear control systems. Internet security attacks have become increasingly more sophisticated and increasingly more political. Much responsibility rests with the private sector in this particular area, and it also involves public-private institutions. I just want to mention a few because it might pique your interest. There are these entities called Computer Emergency Response Teams, CERTs. There are entities called certificate authorities that serve as trusted third parties that authenticate internet transactions via an encryption standard called, or approach called public key cryptography. It's a very challenging area of internet governance, and probably one of the most important issues right now is how to deal with the spate of distributed denial of service attacks that take down government servers. They also take down the servers of human rights activists around the world. It's a very important issue. Just want to mention a couple of others. Interconnection agreements. This is a powerful form of internet oversight as well. Everyone knows that the internet is not actually a cloud. You know that. It consists of switches, buildings, transmission facilities. You can go into buildings. There's raised flooring, there's air conditioning, there are people working there, there are locked doors, there's security, and a lot of transmission links. Now, the internet is a collectivity of networks, or autonomous systems is really what they're called, that conjoin to form the global internet. This is an area that's not at all well understood by the public. It's an area that's very privatized. There are private contractual agreements between service providers, and it's difficult to know what these agreements are. They've typically existed outside of traditional regulation, although there has recently been a great deal of international interest in providing more regulation. I'll come back to that in a moment. And of course, governance also includes the policy formulation or the policy role of private companies. So what's an information intermediary? Social media platforms, search engines, content aggregation sites like Flickr, like YouTube, reputation systems like Yelp. What does Yelp do when there are tons of negative comments because a bakery in Oregon decides not to sell a cake to a lesbian couple for their wedding? They have to make decisions about what they're going to allow, what are the procedures to allow the public sphere to move forward. It's mediated by these information intermediaries. Now, all of them do establish public policy, whether the privacy policies of social media or decisions that platforms make to acquiesce to government requests to hand over personal information or to remove defamatory information from their platforms. They are enacting governance. Finally, internet architecture and intellectual property. It's very confusing in internet governance because IP means both internet protocol and intellectual property. But the intersection of those two, IP and IP, is a governance area that involves the role and the turn, really, to internet infrastructure to regulate content. So we have things like 3 strikes laws or 6 strike laws that will cut off an individual or a household if somebody is downloading pirated movies. We have the turn to the domain name system, which was the Sopa Pipa example for enforcing copyright and trademark law. And of course, there's also the issue of the intellectual property rights that are embedded in the actual technologies of internet governance. So the 3 important ones are the trademark disputes over domain names, the patents that are underlying standards and that restrict which standards can be used in what way, and then the role of trade secrecy in information intermediation. So Google often will not hand over information about its algorithms. It's trade secret protected, so we can't inspect the algorithms. So you have a lot of issues there. So my new book addresses what is at stake in each of these areas, but I'd also like to mention some common characteristics of internet governance technologies and kind of tie it together. The first common theme is that arrangements of technical architecture are arrangements of power. A lot of the institutional and technical aspects of internet governance are behind the scenes, not visible to users in the same way that content is visible. Many of you do study content, it's visible. But they nevertheless embed political and cultural tensions. Now, a lot of scholars in my field of STS do what they call infrastructure studies. If you've heard of Jeff Bowker and the late Susan Lee Starr, I just want to quote from them. They've explained that, quote, "Inverting our common sense notion of infrastructure means taking what have often been seen as behind the scenes, boring background processes to the real work of politics and knowledge production and bringing these to the foreground." Now, bringing infrastructures of governance to the foreground really does reveal the politics of this architecture, as some of the examples I've just described have illustrated. So basically, internet governance certainly involves both scientific reasoning and then the social considerations within that reasoning and issues of power and authority. Now, I also want to mention two other themes. This is a really important one. The second theme is that these infrastructures of internet governance are increasingly becoming proxies for content control. Traditionally dominant institutions of power, whether large media companies or nation states or religious institutions, have lost some of the historic control over the information flows. Think about how corporate media producers have lost control over the monetization of their own content, for example. And traditional intellectual property enforcement, which is based upon things such as notice and takedown of specific information or going after individuals, has done little to stop piracy. So not surprisingly, interest has shifted from content enforcement and ad hominem enforcement, where you go after an individual, to enforcement via infrastructure. So that's where the 3 strikes laws come in. That's where the domain name system blocking comes in. That's where you go after financial companies and say, PayPal, stop providing financial flows to these sites. So it's happening. This is a very big shift in many different areas. Governments also have lost some control over the flow of information, whether it's the ability to stop the leaking of classified national security information. All of these have always been issues, but the loose and leaky nature of the internet is just creating new challenges, right? Or regimes that have lost the ability to censor certain speech. So they're turning to infrastructure as well. The most extreme example is Egypt and the outage of 2011, where they cut off internet access as well as cell phone access. So the truth is that internet choke points do exist, and that even though some are virtual, some are physical, some are virtually centralized, some are more distributed physically, but these choke points do exist, and all of them are being recognized as points of control over internet infrastructure, and therefore points of control over content mediation. So I see that as a big theme in a lot of these areas. And the final theme I'd like to mention is that, well, internet governance is about governance, not about governments. Governance is usually thought of as the efforts of sovereign nation states to regulate activities either within or through their boundaries. Obviously, governments perform many internet governance oversight, whether antitrust, computer fraud and abuse, responding to internet security threats, enforcing child protection measures, enacting privacy laws, all these things. But most internet governance functions are not conducted by the state. They're not the domain of governments. They transcend national boundaries, and they're enacted through technical design via private ordering and through new institutional forms, new institutions that have arisen in a very historically specific context of technological and social change. So you have private companies like VeriSign serving as domain name registries. You have private telecommunication companies doing cybersecurity. There's also delegated censorship and enforcement. So there are a lot of forms of privatized internet governance that are delegated from governmental entities to information intermediaries such as Google. So that is another theme that I say. So the bottom line is that much of internet governance originates in private ordering or is delegated through private entities. So I think I have a few minutes left, Daniel. I'd like to raise just a couple of issues. What are some of the challenges to the future of internet governance and therefore to the future of internet freedom? I think I'll just mention a couple of them and then open it up to discussion. One challenge is the question of what is the future of anonymity? Everybody has probably seen this, at least if you were around in the early 90s. It's the now famous New Yorker cartoon depicting the internet surfing dog with the caption, "On the internet, nobody knows you're a dog." And it is true that the initial technical affordances of the internet seem to normatively promote anonymous communication, including the simple ability to anonymously surf the web from a browser. Or at a minimum, there was traceable anonymity where law enforcement could request some information. But at the content and application level now, there really have been a lot of shifts away from anonymity. Some social media policies and news commentary spaces require individuals to use real name identifiers. Facebook is an obvious example there. At cyber cafes, whether in Brazil or in India, has anyone ever gone to a cyber cafe? You know that you have to hand over your ID. You might also know that Chinese authorities have begun contemplating a policy to require real name identification for access to the internet. So the trend is away from anonymity on several fronts. Now, there's really a huge disconnect between the perceptions of online anonymity, such as portrayed on the screen, and then the reality of an identity infrastructure that gathers information about us, shares it, and all without much of it without our knowledge. So I put this complicated slide up just to illustrate that a lot of technical identifiers can link information sent over the internet to an individual. Some of it's at the level of hardware, such as globally unique numbers on a physical card in a computer. Some of it's via a virtual unique number, like an IP address, or a unique combination of attributes in software. Lots of it is locational, though. So we have the Wi-Fi antenna location, we have GPS in our handheld phones, we have cell phone location from a cellular tower. And the existence of this identity infrastructure beneath a layer of content does make it quite challenging to have anonymity and privacy. But these additional policies on top of that, such as the national policy discussions about the extent of anonymity that should be allowed, are really at the cusp of changing this forever. So I raise that as an issue. I think it's a really big open issue. Now, taking the choice away from individuals and putting it in the hands of gatekeepers is a major shift to internet governance and freedom of expression. Do we want this shift? Is the question, one of the questions that I wanted to raise. And finally, I wanted to raise some questions related to infrastructure, some food for thought about what direction do we want internet freedom and internet governance to go. In many ways, we have more connectivity than ever before. But I want to raise an interoperability question. And I'll do it with some history. In the past 30 years, we made a very difficult shift. This was a shift from proprietary systems to open systems that are interoperable. What's a proprietary system? Businesses would use computers by IBM, or they would use computers by DEC, or they would use computers that were connected by a company like Novell and their operating system NetWare. But you couldn't exchange information between those different systems. the advancement of protocols that are open, such as TCP/IP, enabled interoperability. And even with the initial online proprietary systems of the 1990s, like AOL, Prodigy, CompuServe, you couldn't send email. Daniel and I could not send email to each other if he were on CompuServe and I was on AOL initially. That's the reality that we lived in. It was a difficult move to come up with interoperability. But I'm concerned that several internet trends are taking us back to an era in which interoperability was not a given. In fact, some of the most popular platforms use proprietary protocols now. There's not necessarily interoperability, for example, among social media platforms in the same way there is inherent interoperability among email. There's not the same interoperability in cloud computing. Where there is the goal of interoperability, sometimes it's only made possible by licensing or billing arrangements. So even really popular applications such as Skype, which is wonderful to use, is an example of this category because it uses a layer of proprietary approaches so that I can't just call anyone via Skype. You have to activate that feature through a billing arrangement, for example. So I feel that there is a shift from an open, unified web to a more balkanized. We want to have universal search. We want to have universal interoperability in cloud computing. So I raised that. I think that this deprioritization of interoperability is likely to extend into a lot of different areas, not only cloud computing, but also new infrastructures that are controlled more by apps than by the World Wide Web. So what is the future of interoperability? And of course, interconnection. Do not fall asleep when you hear the word interconnection. There are a lot of things happening on this front. There's international pressure to have more regulation of interconnection. I certainly understand why there would be that concern, because you want to incentivize interconnection. You want to be able to mediate equitable payment structures for the exchange of traffic among network operators. But you may have heard that there was a specific proposal by a European telecommunication network operators group going into a United Nations conference that called for a couple of things. One was sending party pays. Can anyone guess what sending party pays means? Think about that word for a minute. Sending party pays. This suggestion in practice could amount to a content tax, whereby companies like Google, BBC, CNN might be compelled to pay a telecommunications carrier when someone wants to download content from one of these companies. So I think that as an issue, it wouldn't be a positive development for internet growth in the developing world. A lot of companies would make the decision to say, okay, well, we want to provide our content. It raises different issues. So I'm going to raise that in food for thought. And then in terms of universality, I just would like to raise the final issue that in the form of a question. Do we want the domain name system completely transformed into a content enforcement mechanism? The domain name system, as you recall, at the beginning of the discussion, is used just to translate between domain names and IP addresses. However, there are billions of these queries that occur every day. It's very complicated. It's a massive distributed database management system. And the consistent translation of names into numbers is what makes the internet universal, what makes it standardized. So if we start organizing that into these different autonomous systems, what will that do to the future of security, to the future of stability of the internet, and to the future of having a universal public sector as we do now? So in closing, the truth is that the internet is already governed, but that this governance is not at all fixed. It's in a state of flux. And internet governance is important because it inherently involves the technical mediation of the public sphere and the privatization of conditions of civil liberties. This governance is not fixed. Any internet architecture is fixed. It requires constant vigilance. There is an enormous amount of room for more scholars in the area of the intersection of education and this technical infrastructure. because a lot of work needs to be done. I hope that I've provided some insight into the politics of how internet governance currently works, and I hope that I've also provided a few caveats of things that we need to be concerned about going forward, including anonymity, interoperability, some other infrastructure issues that have some implications for the future of internet freedom. So I appreciate the opportunity to speak here today, Daniel. Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me, and I look forward to your comments.